Good morning for everyone dialing in from South Africa. My name is Albert Jansen from Vieren, and welcome to Axiom, our fifth installment for the month of April. I did say morning to everyone in South Africa. We've got a lot of international attendees as well. I saw CG dialing in from Australia. Welcome. Rochelle from Mauritius. Welcome. Ankit from London. Welcome, and a good afternoon to you guys. It is an interesting and a special one today. We have Craig Edwards, who's going to present to us. So Craig Edwards has been with Andile for quite a long time, but he's currently based in Sydney, Australia, and representing Andile there. So Craig will be coming to us live from Australia. As always, we are coming to you from my home. This is my room. We're in the fourth week of lockdown here in South Africa. You can tell that by the length of my beard. So I do want to just put a disclaimer out there, as with every one of us. If you see a child running in, if you hear a dog barking or someone mowing the lawn, it's just part of the situation where we all are in now. So just give us a bit of grace. But yeah, I'm excited for today's session. Craig is going to take us through the key metrics of DevOps today. Just a bit of an agenda for what we are going to take you through. So it's going to be about 45 minutes that Craig's going to share with us. Throughout this session, we're not going to use the raise hand functionality on the webinar. So if you raise your hand at any time, we're not going to answer your question there. But in the middle of your screen, in the bottom, you would see there's a Q&A box. So at any time during the session, you can submit questions, which we would take at the end. We will answer all your questions. So pop all the questions there through the Q&A box at the bottom, and we will answer at the end. And also throughout the session, we will be making use of polling. We've got a couple of polls going on there. So what we will do is we will take you through the polls later on. Apologies, that was the wrong slide. It was a previous one. I don't know how that one wasn't changed there. But throughout the session, we will be making use of polls as well. So there's about 3 or 4 polls that Craig has prepared that he's going to take us through. So what you'll see is you'll see a poll popping up. You can answer the question, and Craig will then answer or discuss the results of the polls. At this point, I'm gonna share less of you, and this is where I'm gonna introduce Craig to you. So Craig, welcome to Axiom.
Oh, cool, Albert. Thanks very much. Appreciate it. As you can see, I'm still shaving, so things are not that rough this side. Stuck in lockdown. It's actually quite exciting to do this today. Something a bit different. And it's quite exciting subject matter. So I think it's, had been fortunate enough over the last couple of years to be involved with quite a few companies where they've focused on DevOps and wanting to apply it in some form or another. And yeah, just some lessons learned and some interesting observations that I'd like to go through. So yeah, thanks very much.
Yeah, if you talk to clients now, all over the past year or so, they've got some digital transformation project going. They've got a DevOps initiative. They've got Agile going. It's one of those buzzwords, keywords and things, and that's why I'm looking forward to today's session for you just to talk us through that and your experience in it. Maybe just a quick background of your experience, your education, what you've been, as an introduction.
Okay, so what I typically enjoy the most, and as I've mentioned, being quite fortunate enough to be involved with across quite a broad spectrum of clients, and typically in South Africa and now in Sydney, trying to refocus our efforts and apply certain things here. But yeah, it's predominantly the architectural side. Still love technology, still love architecture, and helping companies come up with interesting solutions. Consulting, and then like you mentioned up front, been involved with Andile for quite a while now. Quite a broad spectrum of clients in the financial services space, and we've had quite a few successes, and also at the same time we've learned a lot. So yeah, just nice opportunity to discuss it. So, and I promise not to mention pivot. That seems to be another buzzword that everyone's using, and it's quite annoying. So we'll stay away from that as well.
I haven't even heard that one now, so I'm going to start using it now. That's going to be my new one. Yeah, well, Craig, I'm then going to hand over to you. Session is yours, and then at the end we can go through Q&A. So just a reminder, at any time in the session you can submit questions using a Q&A button, and we'll have a session or time dedicated right at the end to answer all your questions. Well, not me, Craig's going to answer them. So Craig, over to you.
Cool, thanks a lot. So up front, the first thing that I kind of want to start getting into is just want to start the presentation. Let's just go all the way to the beginning. Okay, yeah, so there's a presentation. So the first thing that I want to discuss is the target audience. So I had a few people ask me, is this going to be an overly technical session? Is there any reason for them to join if they perhaps don't understand some of the concepts that we're going to discuss? So I think it's quite interesting is that quite deliberately, this discussion needs to be a bit broader than that. We're not going to go too much into the technical. We will touch on some things. So if there's a few technical things and a few buzzwords thrown around, don't stress too much if you don't understand them. Or if you've heard of them, perhaps it will add some clarity. But it really is that the purpose of this is to really address issues that are more broader, and really appealing to all sort of participants in the software delivery process. So one thing that I do want to mention up front, and it's something that is quite interesting to think about. I mean, it's nothing profound, but if you actually step back and think about it, there aren't many companies nowadays that are not involved with the software delivery process anymore. So what I mean by that is, if you look at even like banking institutions, before a lot of the things that were happening in software companies, and they were, the processes that were applying, but banks really, in some organizations didn't really have to stress too much about them. But now we've got to a point where almost all companies are, they might have their core value or business proposition that they're offering and focusing on, but really their destiny is really driven by what's happening from a software perspective. So there isn't really that luxury anymore to ignore the techniques and the things that happen in software delivery as a process. So just clarity, I think it will appeal to everyone. Just want to provide a quick summary of what we're going to cover today. So I'm not going to go into too much detail, but just to kind of set the tone and the context of this discussion, I do want to look at software development or delivery domain. A lot of things the technical people and business people can relate to in this discussion, but I think it's important to kind of just step back and sort of assess, where are we now, what is changing, and more importantly, what is staying the same. I mean, it's been many years now, and there's many things that are not changing. And then after that, I do want to sort of like drill down and get to the sort of heart of this discussion. I want to look at DevOps. I want to discuss what it is, or try and discuss what it is. And then also want to look at it as an initiative. There's a lot of companies that are realizing that it's something that they need to consider. This is a buzzword that's flying around a bit at the moment, or for a while now. And we need to really consider how we go about doing this, and also look at why companies, some of them haven't been that successful or not successful yet. After that, I have given it a bit of thought, and in my opinion, there are some things that I believe are required for an improvement to that situation. At this stage of the discussion, I don't really want to go into how we solve that problem, but I want to offer my opinion as to what I believe are the things that are necessary for improvement. We will still start drilling down into the meat of the discussion. I want to answer those three questions and hopefully come up with a solution from that. So what differentiates successful software delivery companies from those that are not? How is a DevOps initiative initiated and calibrated? So how do you go about, getting somewhere with this process? And then more importantly, how's the effectiveness and progress assessed? So before we continue, I think it's time for a poll. The first poll, I want to just get a feeling for who really is involved in this on the other side of this webinar, just to get a feel for what, in the context of software delivery as a process, where would you kind of say that you are a participant in it? Is it mainly technical? Is it from the operations side of the business, support, operations, that kind of thing? Or is it something that is, other? Sorry, I don't know what that last one is there. There shouldn't really be a fourth option, but those first three, very important. Okay, so I see there's a lot of results already coming through. Just wait for everything to come through. We can perhaps just discuss it. So another reason why I want to look at this is maybe I can also calibrate the discussion a little bit to our audience. So, okay, I see almost everyone's voted. Just wait for a little bit. Okay, so the results are in. So it looks like we've got a predominantly technical audience, and hopefully within that, that's also across a bit of a broad spectrum. There can be developers, architects, testers, security experts. There's so many roles now that are on the more technical side. Operations, very, very important part of this discussion, and then the business aspect. I think that is something that is very, very relevant to this discussion. So I think even for the technical audience, I think considering the other side of this and seeing the wood for the trees, very important. Let's look at the part that actually matters and why we do what we do. So the business aspects. Okay, so I think happy with that. Let's just maybe if we can close that poll now. Okay, so I just want to move on. So the first part, let's look at the current state. I mean, this will be familiar to most, but it's nice to enter this discussion and to sort of touch on all of these things. So really, we're in a situation, and it hasn't really changed. There's a lot of technologies. What's nice is the level of extraction seems to be raising itself. A lot of things that were quite difficult when I started my career are becoming a lot more easier. But what's nice about that is it gives us the opportunity to find the fringe and to kind of push boundaries and to go forward. But in a way, it's also a problem, and that problem hasn't really changed. It's an opportunity and a problem. So what I mean by that is that I just want to briefly talk about something that was exposed to quite a few years ago. So quite a few prominent players in the software development industry. I mean, one of them, Ivar Jacobson, one of the founders or original people that conceived the unified modeling language, and RUP, although he's ashamed to say that he was involved with that, but he was the person that drove RUP before the rational unified process, before Agile came out. They recognized, like a lot of us did, that there were these fundamental problems with software delivery as a process. And what they decided to do is to say, first of all, let's compile a manifesto where we, in bullet form, just bring the essence of what we believe the problem is. And they were quite, they had quite big ambitions of reorganizing everything and providing a new way of approaching software development that would shake everything up. Now, whether they were successful or not, perhaps another debate. I mean, I don't think they're that prominent, so maybe they haven't been, or maybe it's still a work in progress because it's a massive undertaking. But I think the bit that I want to touch on is that manifesto, and it really resonated with me at the time. So a couple of things that they mentioned, and I'm not going to go through all of them. They mentioned that there was this disconnect between academia and industry. In a lot of countries, there is this natural collaboration between academia and industry, and in software as a field, that hasn't really taken off as much. I mean, it's kind of disconnected, but it's not as in your face, really, really conscious effort to kind of get both dimensions participating in the process. The other one was that software, many people like to call themselves software engineers, and I don't think it's a bad thing. It's something that we should strive for, but really, even to this day, it really, really hasn't got the sort of maturity of a proper first-class engineering process. There are differences. I think in some ways, if it had all the red tape, it would stifle some of the things that make software engineering interesting, but it really needs we need to learn a bit more from engineering. And then the most important thing is they quite unashamedly labeled software community as being quite fashion-oriented, trendy, and driven by trends. So, I mean, that's something, we don't want to ever discourage new technologies. A lot of them are relevant. There's a lot of clever people putting these things together. But the problem is, and it happens to all of us, especially on the technical side, you get this excitement, you really want to get into the stuff and start to look at what it is to offer. But ultimately, do all of us always, I mean, there's a lot of us who do, but do all of us always really, truly understand what these technologies are giving us? The first principle, the first rule is they quite casually say in software architecture, everything's a trade-off. So that's the thing you've got to appreciate. I mean, let's take an example of microservices. It is a very interesting architectural pattern. It addresses a lot of architectural concerns in a unique way. There are some problems with it, though. You can't just fully embrace it without realizing that you are trading off on something else. And it does, people are still not underlyingly building their software correctly anyway. So they're adopting microservices and their success is sort of perhaps not fully realized. Another example of it is, let's take NoSQL databases. So it's very, very exciting that you now got these other patterns that you can address when you want to look at data persistence. But the appreciation is that NoSQL databases, document store, key value, column databases, all these new technologies that we have at our disposal, they don't replace relational databases. Ultimately, there are trade-offs. I mean, for example, consistency, availability. These relational databases have their constraints, but they're still very, very relevant in a context. So that's just an example of there being this need to sort of step back and say, we want to use these new technologies, but at the same time, we really need to justify them. I mean, especially in a business, if you're a startup or if you, and I think in today's circumstances, even more relevant with the way things are going to become from an economic perspective, I think it's important that we really step back and say, let's utilize technologies, but let's ultimately be able to justify the usage, and let's also be able to see whether they're having the resultant effect that we would like to. And let's build systems in a way that allows us to move across these technologies, but really make sure that we're doing it for the right reason, not that sort of thing. Okay, and then the last thing that I want to mention is what I can classify as the classical improvement trajectory. So if you look at how software has, the whole industry has evolved over time, it sort of started out with this focus quite naturally on software and software delivery process. The tooling matured, the level of abstraction raised, then we focused a bit more on the requirements of dissertation part. How did we improve that? Testing is improved, security is improved. Our whole way we manage projects has changed. I mean, we've got the sort of agile and lean approaches now, which is a very big step in the right direction. Continuous delivery is something that's very interesting. But what a lot of companies are realizing is there's still something missing. There's still, we're making progress without a doubt, but we definitely are sort of missing out a little bit on a bigger picture. So I just want to go back there. Sorry, jump the slide there. Okay, so that bit there is highlighted. People are looking at it as a sort of a linear progression, and it really has highlighted that operations need to be addressed. So, I mean, I'm not going to deny that it isn't the case, but I still think we're missing out on the big picture. So what I mean by operations needed to be addressed, we're now looking at things like, defining our infrastructure as code. We've got modern platforms in the web and hybrid cloud technologies, serverless. These things enable us to sort of really tackle the bit that's been lacking from an operation point of view. And I mean, not all companies are able to sort of do things in the cloud. There really is this need to especially in South Africa and in an African context, there really is this need to have to do things, from a traditional operations point of view. How do we apply some of the new technologies and lesson learned to that? So yes, it is an area that we need to address. And it is perhaps why people feel and are looking for this concept of DevOps. I mean, at a very superficial level, and I want to get into quite a bit as to why it's perhaps also a bad thing. Not DevOps, but the interpretation of DevOps has been something as simplistic as being purely the synergy between devs and operations and kind of getting these two facets of the business to collaborate and to improve the visibility of that process. It's more than that. So I think it's sort of, let's go into looking at DevOps now. So one of the big problems with DevOps is, and I think it's in the same way that something like software architecture has had problems for many years. If you ask people to define what software architecture is, the difficulty is, not really many people can tell you. I mean, it's getting better now, and I think the irony is we're actually all arriving at the same conclusion with the way the technology is evolving, but it's not something that's that tangible. So DevOps suffers from the same problem. I mean, in my experience, you go in, everyone feels they need to be doing DevOps now. Well, a lot of companies doing it, and if you kind of get the impression that they don't really know what it is. And I even think us as an industry, I mean, DevOps has been going for many years now. I don't think we've even got to a point where we fully understand what DevOps is. It's getting better, but it's still, there's a significant room for improvement. So if you look at, common definitions of DevOps, you would look at that typically cover things like, and there's so many definitions, you look at that cover things like there's a combination between development and operations. It's reliant on a set of practices. It's reliant on leveraging tools, quite a strong focus on continuous delivery. And then, ultimately the objective is high quality software. One would hope that was always the objective, but they seem to really see that as an outcome now. So that's quite exciting. And then lastly, even the guy who came up with the name DevOps, in hindsight, it was quite nice. It kind of got this whole trend going. It's quite catchy. But really, ultimately, it's been a bit of a problem because as we've realized that there's something missing, we've had to add more parts to what DevOps is. I mean, security has become a big focus. Shift left on security. You guys probably heard a lot about that in different environments. There needs to be a more conscious focus on security. But the problem is with that is, it's getting out of control now. As they've realized that there's something missing, you'll see things like Arc Ops, Test Ops, Data Ops. It's just, there's a myriad of different possibilities right now. And I think that speaks to the problem of there being perhaps a misunderstanding or a lack of clarity as to what we're actually trying to achieve here. So I think at this point, time for another poll. What I would like to know is, various companies have gone through the process or in the process of trying to execute DevOps initiatives. I just want to get a bit of a feel as to, where you guys are in your process of DevOps. How would you classify it? Are you making progress? Is it something you would like to get into and haven't really had the opportunity? Is it perfect? Just quite interesting to see across the spectrum of people attending, what we have. Okay, so it seems like there's a lot of involvement. So far, it looks like a lot of people are actually pursuing DevOps as an initiative, and results look promising at this stage. That seems to be the consensus majority. Some people, 20% or so, look, are saying that they haven't really seen a tangible result, and I'm very excited that someone has chosen my last option, because I like to believe that the world is perfect somewhere. So good, nice to see that that's happening. Yeah, so it seems like people are doing this and making some progress, which is promising. Okay. So, okay, let's move on. Sorry, and apologies for talking so fast. I don't really have another mode. This is how I operate. So Devops Anti-Patterns. So I think this is something that is quite interesting, and I think a lot of you will be able to relate to this. So this is what I've picked up going across organizations. Really have seen this in quite often. So this is something that is out there, and I think it's a problem, and I think it's a symptom of there being a problem with DevOps in general. So there's this perception that DevOps is a hire. You're going to get someone that's going to fulfill this, plug the gap that you need to, and you're going to generally have DevOps as something that's working. So I really think as an industry, we need to move away from this idea that you can hire a DevOps engineer. For not doubting in any way that, as technologies progress, and even while we address DevOps, that there are these new gaps that have been identified. I mean, you need people that are looking at like reliability, chaos engineering. You need people that are experts at manipulating infrastructure. You need people that are telemetry experts. But really, the minute you hear someone's looking for a DevOps engineer, it's a problem. I mean, I'm not saying don't go look for a job as one, but when you get there, try and change your title quite quickly if you can. It really is a problem, I think. Then also DevOps, I hear this very often as well, that there's a silver bullet in terms of technology that we can solve it with. If we can just put monitoring in place, if we can just get onto the cloud, and if we can just make our pipelines visible, that we've somehow solved this issue with DevOps. I do think that is a problem. It's not necessarily not an objective, but I think it's something that's causing a lot of harm as well. And then lastly, and I've touched on this a lot, that it's merely the collaboration between development and operations, and that isn't the case. It's a lot broader than that. Okay, so some other aspects to consider, or as we take this discussion a bit further, DevOps is vague and trendy, but I think we've realized that there is this gap, and I think it's objective. Once we've clarified that, is very, very relevant. There is something that needs to be addressed, so I don't think we need to write this off. We need to continue to pursue it, but I think we need to clarify what it is and align our efforts. So I believe, and it sort of is, I'm going to show you this now, a revised definition of DevOps, but I do believe that this is what it really is trying to tackle. It really is this idea that we involve all stakeholders, that we make our processes more transparent. I mean, from the get-go, as being a software developer, when I started out, one of the biggest complaints that my employers or clients had was, it seems like you guys are working in a black box. We really can't tell what we're doing. We're throwing a lot of money at you. What's actually happening in it? And I think that's a problem. It doesn't really benefit anyone if there's no transparency. Communication, a big issue. And then, especially for businesses, there needs to be some justification in the decisions we make. We don't want to necessarily starve for creativity and innovation, but ultimately, once a decision is made and you're empowered to make those decisions, there has to be some element of justification. Otherwise, we're just wasting time, effort, and money. And then processes really need to be repeatable and measurable. So one of the things is, and I mean, this is what I find to be the most difficult, but the most rewarding if you start to get it right, is it is extremely difficult to change habits. I mean, the people element of this, and it's a significant element, it's difficult to change. Habits are difficult to change, culture is difficult to change. So I don't think anyone should underestimate that. The other thing is, as I mentioned on the start of this presentation, most businesses are in the business of software development, whether they like it or not, and they need to appreciate that. So while it might seem like it should really only be applicable to software development companies, really all companies need to be considerate. Even companies that are, manipulating vendor products, they really need to think about what this means for their product and their service offering. And then lastly, and most importantly, if a company does take the attitude of not really wanting to participate in it or ultimately delay it, the reality is competitors are not waiting. So in the same way, a lot of more sort of conservative organizations have realized over time that whether they like it or not, they've got to adopt project management techniques like Scrum. This is going to be the same thing. Competitors are not waiting. They're moving on and they're doing it. So I think you can't afford to be left behind in this process. So let's look at a refined DevOps definition. And this seems to be one of the more recent definitions, and I feel that it does sort of cover a lot more. It's closer to the truth. Really there it's showing that it's 4 dimensions that are typically tackled by this. it brings them all together. I mean, we've all heard about continuous delivery and automating our business processes and pipelines. Our whole value stream needs to be automated, but the technical element of it is very important. We've been looking a lot at agile and lean processes. That's another leg or another dimension that's quite relevant for this. And then that third one, I really truly believe that is a significant aspect, and one that really should come to the forefront, is the culture and leadership aspect. And we'll touch a bit on what that means a bit later, but that is really the part that has been lacking in terms of its focus. So you'll see there quite a broad definition, and in some ways, if people are struggling already to get DevOps and to make it a success, this should be an alarm bell. You should start to think to yourself at this point, we've got this significant thing we're trying to achieve. It's almost utopian in some sense. How do we actually go about making some progress, and how do we realize it? So that is a valid concern at this stage. So just the last part I want to go through. I just want to get a feel for people, for companies that have been driving DevOps initiatives. How much of a focus has that third leg been on it? The culture and leadership elements. Has it been something that's prominent, or is it really been more of a technical focus at this stage? So I just want to wait for results to come through. Okay, that's quite positive. I think I've seen quite a nice balance between those of you who believe it is something that's been looked at, and then a lot that are sort of unsure. They don't really know if that's something that's relevant or it fits in with the process at this stage, or for whatever reason. So it's quite nice to see that is actually in fact the case, and perhaps should have taken it a bit further just to find out, maybe we can discuss it later, how successful that's been, because it is very, very difficult, and that's what I've experienced in the places that I've been taking this. Okay, so let's move on. So now we've defined DevOps, we've got a bit more clarity, hopefully, if I'm not talking too fast. But let's go through and try and see what I believe. And at this stage, I'm not offering a solution. I'm just trying to think that there's something that we need to kind of rectify the situation, or to take it one step further and improve it. I want to just identify what that is, and then we can go through and see if we can come up with a solution. So what I believe is we really do need a unified perspective. You've already seen that definition is quite broad. It's trying to, it's quite ambitious in its undertaking. We need a way to kind of bring all parties to the table, and to bring that sort of like I said there, unified perspective, where we can have almost like a Rosetta Stone, some way, a common way of communicating and translating our different perspectives, and to assess how we're tackling this, whether we're making progress, what are we actually trying to achieve, what are our objectives. So a unified perspective, I think, is definitely needed. We need a universal way to evaluate this whole, our software delivery processes, and also across. So, I mean, for example, if you think about potential investors, it might get to a point where if these kinds of things have gained acceptance, and they appreciate that the company has a software development delivery process, there might be this unified perspective, and this new technique might be a way of saying, that's how we evaluate companies, or this is how we evaluate across our projects, or competitors even, what are they getting right? Let's see what's happening. So that's very important. And then the yardstick to measure efforts, and I mean, you need some way to basically assess if your energy is your resources that you're applying are making any difference. If you're applying energy in the right places, I think that's very important. And then, a lot of consultants, myself included, are probably reading a little bit about this statement, but there needs to be some sanity behind this process. Snake oil and all that stuff, it's very rewarding, but I think we need to not use it anymore. And then lastly, I think there need to be targeted perspectives. So while there needs to be a universal perspective where there's some shared vision and shared collaboration, there really does need to be targeted domain-centric perspectives where, I mean, if you look at the software dimension, where you can have things that you're busy looking at that are really relevant for your domain, that you can then in some way relate to that unified perspective, and you can manipulate them and calibrate them and things, and see what difference it makes. So that's what I believe we need, is a new perspective. And also I think we need a refined approach. So whichever way we come up with to actually tackle this problem, or this opportunity, it really needs to be some way that's a unified approach that you can apply to all kinds of projects. It's simplistic. It mustn't be too prescriptive. I think if anything, we've seen the techniques that work quite nicely these days are those that are not prescriptive, that offer some element of flexibility, and also encourage things like innovation and creativity. There needs to be less red tape, more control, traceability. So I'll get more into that, but there really needs to be less stringent control. We need to achieve control, but we need to have less sort of red tape, bureaucracy, those kinds of things. So I don't want to go too much into that now. I'll cover this now. And then something that I think is critical, we need to have engineering discipline and a basis in science. I mean, the scientific method, well established, it proves it works. It does offer a lot of room for creativity and innovation, but it gives you a framework to operate in, which I think is something that's really relevant. And I don't think it's something that's explored as often. So we need to be able to experiment. We need to be able to validate and verify our results. We need to be able to have a repeatable process. We need to have processes that are both observable and measurable and be able to share our findings. I think that is critical. I mean, not only is transparency important, but I think peer review and communication extremely important. And we've seen the significant benefits it's had in the scientific method and in scientific communities already. And I think, why should we not be able to leverage something similar? And then also traceability, record changes, outcomes, that kind of thing. So this is where things get quite important. And this is where the discussion gets quite interesting, I think. So I want to discuss what I consider, and I think a lot of organizations are considering it now, is to be a seminal work in this field. Something, and there's a book out, which we'll discuss now. So this bit of work is something that I've typically used quite a lot at clients to get the discussion going. So if we are starting up a DevOps initiative, as one-dimensional as that sounds, if we are starting to go through the exercise of making these improvements, I like to start with this book is because really this effort, as you've seen from that description, is something that has to really be covered by the business. All participants in the process have to have something that they can identify with and use as a starting point for discussion, and then perhaps the different facets can go off and drill down into their dimensions. You know, the business people can go more into something like the lean books and whatever other books they have in their field. The development people can go into books like I mentioned, their DevOps Handbook and Phoenix Project, Unicorn Project, all these other exciting books, but that are more relevant and detailed. I mean, if you give one of those books to business people, they're not going to understand or even want to understand what's really being covered in a lot of that stuff. So this book is important. I really highly recommend it if you haven't read it already. If you have read it, perhaps just step back and reconsider what you've read in that book. So the book was written by 3 people. The last 2 are significant protagonists and thought leaders within the DevOps community. Their track record does speak for themselves. So Jez Humble and Jean Kim, that DevOps Handbook is something it's really recommended to read. I highly encourage it, and Continuous Delivery is a sort of cornerstone book in understanding that process. They were involved with this. And then Dr. Nicole Forstrin, she brings the research element. So the format the book takes is quite interesting as well, and I'll get a bit more into what the book covers, but it really is, it backs a research process. So I'll describe what their research process is. So a significant portion of the book describes this research that they went and undertook, and the second half describes their findings, which are very interesting. So if you're not interested in the research process, go ahead and read just the second half. If you like research, you find it exciting, or if you would like to just be skeptical and try and second guess what their findings are, go ahead and read what the methodology was. It's a very, very good book, and yeah, highly recommend it. So let's just get into it a little bit as to what they're trying to do. So there's been a lot of people that attempted to try and assess this DevOps movement, to try and figure out who's winning, who's losing, what's making some people successful, what isn't. With this focus on the software delivery performance aspect, there's typically been a common belief that software delivery performance doesn't really have any relation in any way to competitive advantage. You know, unless you're a software company, but really, you know, those things are independent. So they took a significant sample size of fairly relevant players, quite a few companies, and they conducted a 4-year research project and applied very stringent, well thought out research methodology to that process. And they had some interesting findings. So they were able to discredit that perception. And we'll get a bit more into discussion as to what it is. So just to end off here, I really recommend you go read it, and it's really not something that's overly technical. So you can, anyone that's got some interest in this, go ahead and read the book. So what were their research objectives? They wanted to have a valid way and a reliable way of defining software delivery performance. I mean, how do you really define what is a significant or successful delivery of software? That's quite an interesting and a difficult thing to do. Measurements of performance is quite difficult, and the deliverables are intangible. And I think that's what makes it difficult. So 2 of the other problems they identified were that most attempts to measure performance of software delivery process focused on more on outputs and more on the individual than global outcomes-based things. And and they didn't focus on the collective, the global outputs. They were looking at those things. So a good example is, I mean, thankfully it's changed a lot, but it's also still there. So back in the day, a lot of people tried to micromanage and assess the performance of individuals by counting lines of code. Thankfully, as insane as what that is, that died down a bit. But you know, I've heard recently people counting commits. Another thing that's quite prominent is, and it's a bit of a distortion of the Scrum process, is there is this heavy scrutiny of velocity within a team as a measure of performance, especially at an individual level. So, you know, if anything, velocity, as we all know, should be an internal measure, something that a team uses itself to kind of calibrate itself, encourage itself to perform optimally, and to see itself relative to each iteration of that Scrum process. But it gets a bit abused, and that's a problem. Okay, so just to go into their research criteria. So they had two key characteristics that they wanted to measure performance by. However they were going to measure performance, it really had to be outcomes-based and not output-based. So they really can't see, you know, producing stuff, but is it really valuable? Is it any valuable to this? You're just producing things. And really it should have a global view, because that's how businesses ultimately view these things. You know, you're going to internally assess the people that are working for you and the techniques and technologies that you're using. But really, as a business, you're caring about what's being delivered, and you're really meeting your business objectives. So that was the other thing that they wanted to assess it by. Their results, they were quite interesting. They did come up with, or did prove that they could qualify and measure software delivery performance. They did find a positive relationship between those two, between organizational performance and software delivery performance. So the way they did it was they actually went and found companies that were performing optimally as a business, successful, good market share, really making significant improvements. And then they went and looked and saw, how are you guys actually approaching your software? And what they actually discovered is quite an interesting thing. Across the people that were successful, there were these common things that kept arising. A real common and perhaps overly utilized example would be Netflix. There's things that they are doing very, very well as a software business, but it didn't just apply to Netflix. It was applying to quite a few organizations. So they also identified from that, once they were able to find that relationship and prove from a research perspective scientifically that there was this correlation between the two, they also found that there were certain capabilities for a technical, process, and cultural point of view that were sort of supporting these processes. There was things that they were doing that they had in common across those businesses. So what came out of this was they were able to kind of qualify performance by 4 key metrics. And this is quite interesting. And they found it held up, and it's held up over the 4 years of their research. So I want to discuss now a little bit these 4 key metrics. And I think if anything you get out of this, remember this, because this is quite interesting. It really does distill itself down to this. First one is deployment frequency. So how often are businesses getting out software out into production, available to their customers, getting it into a staging area, endlessly developing software with the intention of getting it into customers' hands really isn't doing much. If anything, we need to get it as quickly as possible into the hands of the customer. If you look at even the lean startup movement describes it, you want to basically build stuff in such a way as quickly as you can get stuff into the hands of the customer. So successful companies are doing so rapidly, multiple times a day, thousands of times a day in some cases, and your least successful ones, even in my experience, I've witnessed it for various reasons. They are getting it up maybe quarterly, they maybe biannually, in good cases, maybe weekly. Then delivery lead time, another very, very important measure. So yeah, the delivery lead time is defined as basically from when a change request comes in to it actually being delivered. So this does not mean when you start working on it. You know, I've seen a lot of scenarios where work, and for also, once again, many reasons, work sits for a long time. The measurement we actually care about here is we've been asked to do something, when does this actually become realized? And trying to manipulate that and trying to improve that dimension has significant reward in terms of your business, quite nicely, and then also your software delivery. So successful companies, I mean, within hours, less than an hour, some are taking a lot longer than that. Then the next one is time to restore. So service. So if you look at your mean time to recovery, that is identifying things. So first of all, the ability to identify quite rapidly, it really speaks to some maturity in your process. So if you have got the ability to pick up root cause of your problems and identify them at runtime, or even before runtime, you've got some maturity there. And that was the average time it takes once those things become identified to rectification. So measuring that, figuring out successful companies do that quite quickly. Then lastly, change fail rates. So you're pushing out a lot of changes. I've seen this too in a lot of cases. Company, really put a lot of emphasis behind velocity. They get stuff out, but then things go wrong in the field quite a lot for various reasons. So why are they going wrong? And what is the percentage of the things that you actually get out there? And how many of them are going wrong? So those 4 key metrics, if there's anything you get out of this discussion, just take it. It seems overly simplistic, but what's quite nice, it does distill down to just these 4. And everything else is really feeding into this. So in their book, and it's quite interesting that they report the results in a lot more detail than this, but they show how companies from the onset, with applying various techniques, how they are able to improve and become, transition from the poor performance dimension or level all the way up through to high in some cases, and what that really means to their business. So, and there are some weird anomalies with some of the results, and what's quite interesting is the way in which they go about explaining those anomalies. So a bit outside of the scope of this discussion, but if you read the book, you'll see that. So, for example, as I alluded to earlier, companies that are successful are deployed regularly. They've got, mean time to recovery is very low, and the lead time for changes is quite small as well. So, yeah, not going to say too much about that. And then just want to quickly also talk about some of the key capabilities that drive these improvements. So you'll recognize a lot of stuff with this, but they really just once again affirm that they are actually adding value. So continuous delivery, definitely something that helps a lot. Shifting left on security, bringing your security processes right up into the onset of your project, automating a lot of those things. You'll see, what's quite exciting, a lot of banks we're even seeing now, they're starting to incorporate, take that aspect quite seriously. They vet a lot of the stuff from a security point of view, right up to the actual deliverables that go out into production. It's quite nice to see how that's been maturing. Continuous delivery pipelines, continuous integration has been around quite a long time. And unfortunately, not enough usage of trunk-based development. So I still see excessive usage of branch and reliance on branches. And I think in some ways it's something we should try and get away from. It doesn't mean that they're not relevant, but there needs to be things like ways of utilizing those with some responsibility. Architecture, perhaps a topic for another discussion, but yeah, there's a lot that can be done here, and it's not as prevalent as one would like it to be. So yes, we're understanding loosely coupled architectures. That's really obvious now from a microservices point of view, but I still don't think we're viewing that right. What is architecture? How do we approach it? How do we leverage the different infrastructural components and what the trade-offs that they offer? And how do we measure even things like fitness functions? Are we addressing the quality characteristics that these things should be addressing? And evolutionary architectures, things like that, big movement for that at the moment. So there's a lot that's happening in that space, but a lot of work to go still. Products and process, so viewing the value stream, appreciating that there is this concept of a value stream. That is this simplistic way of defining everything from conception all the way through to delivery and managing this whole process in a uniform way. Working in small batches, the ability to experiment as well. Consider things like Conway's law there and inverse Conway's maneuver. How are we arranging our teams? How much of an impact does that have on our software? What's working, what isn't working? There's some really exciting things happening in that space as well. Lean management and monitoring. So it's taking off. Perhaps not that much in big corporates at this stage, but startups and smaller companies, fintechs that have to be a lot more innovative at this stage, they really are focusing on that. So basically proactive notification of things, monitoring telemetry systems, work in progress limits, making sure that we don't try and tackle too many bits at once, getting things out fast. And then very importantly, and the bit that's perhaps lacking a little bit, is the cultural aspect. So job satisfaction, the leadership, the way leadership handles this process and the way in which they manipulate their companies and react to it and provide the frameworks that are needed to support the preceding dimensions. So that is something that really needs a lot more focus on, is the leadership dimension. Okay, so going back to what I originally said, that we needed something to improve this process. I want to just see if we've finally got to a point now where we have what we need. So one thing I believe we have is with those 4 key metrics, it really does give us our unified perspective. So if everyone sort of focuses that, all participants in this process of the software delivery, regardless of who you represent, if you've got an interest in it and you can perceive, I'm reluctant to use the word maturity, but if you can see the state and the progress you're making as a team, in the context of those 4 key metrics, I think we've gained something there. It's something that's not too technical. It's something that anyone can sort of understand, and it's relevant, as we've seen based on that research. So I really do think that gives us our unified perspective, and it's at the macro level. And then at the lower level, as I've mentioned before, it gives us now a framework to kind of rationalize about more granular perspectives, more domain-specific perspectives. They will actually be the levers that we manipulate and measure to see if we're making any changes to that unified perspective. So if I'm, say, for example, let's just take an example. If I'm in the security field and we are focused on, say, maintaining our deployment frequency, because you don't really want to negatively influence it at all. You want to be able to show that you're applying, you've improved the quality from a security point of view, but you haven't in any way negatively impeded the ability to deliver rapidly or held up anything on the process. Or if you are someone that's involved with the software development process and there's been this discussion that you'd like to increase the level of test automation, that you can show that you somehow applied various techniques and we're having a positive influence on that unified perspective. So those granular perspectives are important. Okay, and then lastly, I think we've got the ability to apply a more scientific approach. The fact that there's a lot of measurement involved, but also you can select and choose. We've got to predominantly focus on those top level measures, the unified perspective. I do think it gives us a framework to apply a scientific approach. So just some principles. When you do set out to kind of continue with your DevOps initiatives, or if you're in a situation where you feel, look, maybe we've been about on this in a way that it wasn't that effective and we'd like to look back, what are the first principles that should guide all your discussion, your decision making, and you should remember? So I truly believe that you shouldn't believe your project is unique or not applicable, or you shouldn't believe that you're in a situation where we really do this with our new projects, but our old ones or our vendor products don't really make a difference. I think all the projects are unique. You can make a difference, which we'll get a bit more into now, how to do that. But you really got to look at it. And also don't get caught up too much in relative position. It's not a race. I think if anything, what we learn from this is it's not really something that you finally get to the end of it and you say, okay, it's perfect. Like anything in our domain, it's continual improvement. The important part here is to see relative change, is to see and justify that what we are doing in our field and what we are busy tackling, it has some sort of positive outcome, or maybe it's not relevant. Everything's always a work in progress, and that's very important. Anyone who's been exposed to your typical maturity modules, a lot of them do assume like a utopian destination. Really, this isn't that. This is just something that can continuously be applied to make some improvements. Okay, I've mentioned the continuous improvement. And then another thing too is I want to mention as a principle, something that I've always sort of kept in mind when it comes to making significant changes to businesses. You need to always find the blend between tackling the technical and the strategic. So if, especially as a consultant, when I've gone into places and I am going to tackle a project like this, make a significant change to a business, or I've done it in some other context, I always try and strive for considering the strategic, the long term, the things that are harder to achieve, but also in the short term, looking at the low hanging fruit, the tactical things. You want to find a blend between two of those. You want to do things quite quickly to make significant changes, but you don't want to ignore your strategic things as well. What are the things that are harder to get right in the long term? You definitely want to be able to be creative and adaptive and innovative. So whatever you're doing, it's going to take some creativity to make changes. You're going to have to think about it's going to involve all participants, but you want to have that still. And then all changes must be justified and evaluated in the context of those key metrics. I think that's important because you shouldn't be doing it for any other reason. Ultimately, the real objective here is to improve business or whatever the business's objectives are. Okay, and I'm going to touch a bit more on this now. So, knowing your current state is a prerequisite for improvement. So those are the first principles. I think keep them in mind. There'll probably be a lot more that you'd come up with, but those are things that really should form the foundation as to when you go on this journey of trying to tackle the DevOps. So how do you go about, maybe there are different ways of doing this, but this is what I've typically used in the past. How do you initiate this DevOps improvement process? So what I've always done is, definitely I think you need to kind of focus on knowing where your as-is position is. So in the context of those 4 measures, and it doesn't have to be all of the measures, all of the other low-level measures, but those 4 measures are critical to know how is your current products and your delivery process positioned in the context of those 4 key measures. And we are collecting enough information to answer that question at this stage. So I think that's a very good starting point. Regardless of what the result is, if you know that our business is typically delivering software quarterly, or what our change failure rate is X, and you're quite confident about what the accuracy of those measures are, I think that's quite a good place to be in anyway, because knowing where you are, it gives you opportunity for improvement. So there needs to be some focus there. So automating and making sure that you actually are putting a bit of thought behind how you're measuring, that there's accuracy and consistency. Otherwise, those measurements are perhaps worse than not having them. And then sharing and communicating. And then lastly, adopting a scientific approach, an approach which is repetitive. Whatever you do, you've got to think, you know what, and this is speaking to something like Lean Startup again, you want to be able to formulate experiments. You might have a new technology and you say, you know what, or new technique, and you say, let's test it out on a project or a set of clients or the whole value stream, and let's see whether we're actually getting the results that we think we need to. I mean, if we are investing a lot in automated testing, and you know, I've always struggled with that. A lot of companies, they don't believe that it's that necessary, or they can bypass it. But you know what, let's prove empirically that the 4 key metrics benefit over time from, you know, maybe focusing on automated testing or whatever the different things you're going to focus on. Then also evaluating, measuring results, and adjustment, and then automating bureaucracy. So just something that I do want to discuss is you'll often see that companies that are struggling with something will try and remedy the situation by introducing more controls. So if there's a lot of failure or if there's a mismatch and they're not really succeeding, they will try and mitigate against those failings by putting in more red tape. And if you think about a simple example of a developer, I make a change now, and then there's this long-winded process that it has to go through before it finally lands up in the customer's hands or in production, and it finally fails there. By the time it gets back to me, I've long since forgotten, or maybe I've moved on. I mean, I don't even know what's happening. So it's very inefficient. We need bureaucracy, we need compliance, we need governance, but I think you will see now a significant movement of incorporating that into the value stream. There's been a big effort now to bring a lot of these checks and balances both at build time and at run time. So policy compliance, not only enforced, also observed to make sure that systems are compliant. I mean, a simple example would be something like security. I mean, in the past, it was all about security, intrusion detection. Now it's also very much intrusion prevention. Now it's intrusion detection as well. So we need to have that red tape, but it needs to be incorporated into our processes. Okay, and then lastly, I want to finish off with some terms and conditions, because unfortunately that always seems to crop up. Especially from the perspective of starting out in this process. So in that research, we saw that they did it in the inverse kind of way of tackling it. They found companies that were successful and they kind of scrutinized their software delivery processes. But if you're starting out, unfortunately, it'll be the other way around. You will go through the process, you'll be able to quite easily with those 4 key metrics verify that you are what the success of your software delivery process is. But is it validated? So the difference is there, you may be building what's requested, but you may not necessarily be building what's needed. So in the same way, the software people and all the other different participants have their lower level metrics. Business really needs to focus on their lower level granular metrics that's assessing things like return on investment. You know, are we actually getting the value that we would like to get out of the stuff that we're building? And then feed it back in the inverse back into the business to see what changes can be made, or from a product requirements point of view, or even a process point of view. So that's very, very important. The next one is, it's not a perfect science. So it's almost semi-formal. We're moving in the right direction and improvement is required. But the disclaimer here is it's not going to be this perfect scenario. Maybe one day we'll get there. So in no ways is this process a laboratory conditions. It's not a sterile environment. You don't manipulate one dimension like you do in proper scientific experiments and you can see cause and effect. Yeah, you unfortunately will have to do a few, but you're getting close to the ability to rationalize about that. So it does introduce some degree of formality. Okay, cool. So sorry, I know that was rushed. I know we had limited time, and like I said, I don't really know how to talk slowly. So yeah, a lot of information, but I think if you can just get the gist out of it, the 4 key metrics and this idea that there's this collaboration between participants, I think yeah, that's what I really wanted to communicate. So Albert, yeah, back over to you.
Craig, thank you very much for that. I think it's a good thing that you talk so fast, because you were able to get through a lot of content during that session. We have a couple of questions that came through, and I think the first question I'm going to ask you. I'm going to start off with a polling question for you, that I'm asked. So, you think in the current state that we're in, finding ourselves in almost going into a post-COVID-19 world, we know our projects, the way we look at projects are going to change, the way we look at development, the way we look at the world is going to change for the good of it. Do you think companies who adopted a DevOps culture and have successfully employed it are ahead and it's working better for them? Do you think companies are now going to start spending more on DevOps or maybe less on DevOps? Or do you think it's probably got no impact at all on
gut feel on my side, I think it brings focus. So if anything, we've seen the world kind of reeling right now. The appreciation that you know, the things we are doing from a software point of view are very, very relevant. So I think it's going to bring some clarity to the process and maybe some focus. I think none of this is novel. A lot of this is, everyone knows about it, but it's just that clarity that brings it. And I think our situation brings it too. And I mean, maybe look, this is perhaps just my perception, and especially being in Australia, one of the things that I have been finding quite interesting is a lot of the ways they try and tackle problems here do resonate a lot with what I know from software. Okay, look, it's buzzwords again, but they measure like sort of really adaptive, agile way of doing certain things. So I do think there's a lot normal society can learn from the things that we've learned, but also I do think it'll bring focus.
That's insightful. Yeah, thanks for that. A couple of questions. If we go through, I think on your side, you can also view them. First question, in your view, what is the most common mistake banks make when it comes to delivering software?
Look, I don't want to say it's necessarily a mistake. Perhaps my arrogant opinion in the past would have said that, but as I've kind of been exposed more to the banks over the years, I do appreciate the world that they're operating. I mean, your hands are tied all the time. You've got to comply. It's massive organizations. What for me is quite exciting is there has been this realization that they need to mature their processes. And as I mentioned, that there has been this realization that there are software companies, whether they like it or not. So it's not about making mistakes. It's just not really appreciating that. But what is exciting is, there's a lot of banks now that are starting to mature and are actually being quite impressive. They put a lot of your traditional software companies to shame, but they've got a long journey ahead of them. The odds are stacked against them just given the inertia of those companies, but I think their heart's in the right place and they're going with it.
Yeah, I think it's the maturity. You gave a good answer there. Yeah, next question. Can DevOps get to a stage where it's over-engineered? And if so, how can we prevent it from happening?
I think anything can be over-engineered. I've normally been the protagonist behind over-engineering things. I think we all do it, especially as software developing engineers. But look, there's a cost to that. And I think if we keep that focus on justifying every decision, that's important. You have to. I mean, someone's paying for this stuff, and you've got to make sure they're getting value for money. But I think the bit is when you over-engineer things, to answer that question, I do think it's important to have hindsight. By over-engineering something, you're learning something there. Try and avoid it, but it's not necessarily a bad thing.
I think I enjoyed the beginning when your agenda question, when you asked who's from technical and business, and there was a good balance between the two. And you can't lose sight of the business objective that you're trying to achieve. And that should help you also not to over-engineer it. You can't just, there's still a business problem statement that you need to address.
I think, I've seen that more as I've done the consulting thing, and that, they don't easily dish out funds these days. You've got to really add value quickly. I think a lot of employees can learn that, appreciate someone is paying for this stuff, but
Yeah. Next two questions, you can maybe look at it together. The one was, does DevOps replace Agile? And the next question, and from someone else, was, if DevOps replaces Agile, what are the fundamental differences between DevOps and Agile?
So I think DevOps emphasizes agility. If anything, it should enable companies to become more agile. So no, it doesn't replace it. They coexist. They work in synergy. But I do think DevOps is mainly about bringing that shared perspective, anything, and opening up and making things transparent and bringing some sort of uniformity and predictability to the way we build things. So I do think they coexist. They're not mutually exclusive concepts. Yeah,
good. Next question is there any correlation between the 4 metrics and team size?
Look, one interesting thing in that book is they do kind of like make some recommendations. They spent a lot of time studying the composition of teams. I have seen quite a few South African companies, very mature software companies, that have adopted a lot of those practices before I even found out about the book. And I do think they're very, very effective. As example, we compose teams a lot with typical Scrum teams in that, but this idea of having sort of cross-cutting disciplines and pods, and the way in which they're structured, I don't really want to get into that, but yes, I do think there is some best practices that have been discovered, but you want to keep them at a certain level, but you want to bring the sort of increase the collaboration between them. So read the book, they go through that quite nicely, and if we can have a more in-depth discussion offline, but I do think there is a sort of like happy medium there that's been realized over time now, and it's working.
Maybe just on that point, from Axiom and Andile point of view, we're very much happy to create a forum. If you read a book, if you want to have further discussion, just let us know. Craig is available. You're not doing much in Oz. You're just sitting in your...
No, it's very laid back and no one does anything. Economy just runs.
Yeah, like a mate. If you want to have just a session where we can have more discussion, we welcome that. That is the idea of Axiom, to have a basis to create discussions.
Yeah, and I mean, look, what's been quite nice is there's a lot of exciting things happening in South Africa. I think there's a lot of things happening here that aren't happening in South Africa, but it's nice to just do the comparison. Both can learn from each other. So I'd like to, if anyone's got any suggestions for further topics, you're welcome. Or any discussion offline, not a problem.
We've got two more questions, so we can quickly go through. Luckily, you talk quite fast. I can also go quite fast. And this is from Neil, our CIO. One comment. You have to keep in mind that automation is not always the optimal option for operation implementation and should be evaluated and weighed accordingly. Similar to blockchain, is the solution to everything, i.e. embrace the culture of DevOps?
Yeah, look, I agree. There's some things that are difficult to automate, and ultimately you've got to justify automation. So that was always a thing. I mean, I've seen very, very successful projects, perhaps as a byproduct of over-engineering, where we haven't had a significant sort of coverage of automated tests. But really, there are some things that does hold true, but it must be a natural discovery. So none of this is meant to be forced, but ultimately the taking from this, whatever you do must be justified. And that's the warning that I would like to give to technical people. You know, business has got to appreciate that technical people have got to grow. We've got to adopt these really relevant technologies, but ultimately someone's paying for this. You've got to make sure that you're adding value to your business. I mean, that's what it's there for in the first place.
Last one. This one comes from Kieran Edwards, your brother. Can you elaborate a bit more on how one goes about automating bureaucracy?
Okay.
That is a typical Edwards question.
Yeah, so I'm very reluctant to answer this. Okay, so I think you'll see that there's a lot of ideas. Like a good example would be the way policy is handled. So there's a lot of prescriptive policies that are both enforced and also monitored. So if you look at the policy, policy monitoring and defining policy at runtime, there's a lot of things that are bringing that into it. You know, making sure that the things that you would typically check are covered. So if you really step back and think, what was that bureaucracy trying to achieve? And it was trying to get to a point where there's some comfort in errors not getting out into production, things like that. So really mature testing processes, stringent security, and traceability, the ability to be able to prove that you are doing these things from an auditing perspective, eliminates a lot of that stuff. It won't fully do away with it, but the idea is to kind of reduce its relevance.
Craig, thank you very much. That was insightful. The content, you can see there's a lot of effort, a lot of research, a lot of years of experience that went into us to cram it into a session like this. Closing thoughts maybe from you there, Down Under, before you go to bed.
No, I think, like you said, exciting times, very, very scary times as well. But I think, for companies, banks need to reinvent themselves. I think they are doing that. A lot of the big organizations are to remain relevant, but also for the smaller companies. I mean, talking ourselves, fintech company, very, very exciting opportunity. But I think it's not one or the other. It's the collaboration that's important. That's something I'm even seeing here. There's this idea that if you can start to get these traditional companies and more innovative companies collaborating and trying new exciting things, software is very, very relevant at the moment. And I think that's one thing that this situation we find ourselves in is actually presented one significant opportunity.
Great. Thank you very much. Cool. Thank you very much, all the attendees that joined us. If you have any questions, if you want to have access to the recording, or if you want to have just another discussion with Craig or anyone, please email us at axiom@andilesolutions.com, and we're happy to get back to you on that too. Like I'm saying, that all the sessions are recorded and we can give you access to them. We've got one more session left next week, Wednesday, by Erik van der Linde. One I'm looking forward to again. It's DVP using distributed ledger technology. He's going to talk to us around it from a blockchain point of view. So really looking forward to that. Thank you, everyone. We ran a bit over time, but I think the subject matter needed that. Craig, cool. Good luck.
Thanks very much, everyone. Cheers. Bye-bye.